it will review the international response to the war, to the also the sanctions imposed on Russia, and how this affects the economic, regional, and global economies, and the alternatives before the whole world to deal with the implications of those sanctions, especially when it comes to the fuel prices, energy prices, as well as basic food commodities on the short, medium, and long term. We have with us from Doha Dr. Ali Khalifa, Professor of Economy in the state of Qatar and a founder of Economic Plan. From Tennessee, Dr. Mahmoud Haddad, who is joining us from Tennessee, Martin, and Mr. Nasser Tamimi from London, who is a resident researcher in the UK. Welcome, dear gentlemen. I would like to start the first part with Dr. Khalifa, who is an associate professor in the University of Qatar. So, economic sanctions were imposed on Russia to punish it for its invasion of Ukraine. How would this affect the global economy? Thank you. Thank you for having me. There are a lot of economic repercussions due to this invasion by Russia of Ukraine, especially when it comes to the prices of energy and food. In reality, the prices of oil and energy specifically has increased more than 60% during the invasion month, and then it led to an increase in the prices of electricity, transportation, shipping, and commodities. Also, the manufacturing sector that heavily relies on energy sector is going to face some difficulties. The same goes for agriculture, tourism, and commerce in general. Now, as to how this affects the world, we have three different parts or chapters. Those suffering heavily, we see that Ukraine is totally destroyed due to the war, and Russia also because it is the country incurring sanctions. As for the European countries and the US, due to the increase in the energy and natural gas prices, this affects manufacturing in general and leads to a general price increase in those countries. Now, the other category is the developing countries, importers of oil, gas, and food. I'm talking here about Africa, specifically in Egypt, for example. They suffer a lot from this because they are fully importers of 70% of their own needs of cereals and grains from Ukraine, and the rest from Russia. The same goes for Tunisia and other African countries who are suffering due to the decrease in the assistance very soon. Because now the world is focused more on Ukraine and the war happening there. Then the most affected countries are the African countries in particular. There are some countries that may benefit, but in a partial manner, such as Iran and Venezuela, considering they will benefit from the American pressure and the European pressure on them going down, and they may make gains due to the increase in the prices of oil and gas, because the United States right now has started to negotiate with them so as to obtain the Iranian oil and gas and the Venezuelan oil and gas to make up for the gap caused by the war by Russia on Ukraine. So that's related to the categorization of countries in the world, who is going to be mostly affected and how by this problem. Some countries may be better managed or may better manage this issue than others. Who would be mostly damaged and who would, even if partially, benefit for China. If it stays on the side of Russia as they had announced, undoubtedly those sanctions will greatly affect the Russian economy and their GDP may drop greatly. So this has to do with the potential implications on the energy prices and which countries may feel damaged or not. So you see that the economic repercussions of this war are different, but the ones that are mostly affected are Africans. Now I would like to speak about Mr. Mahmoud Haddad from Tennessee University. So there is a decision to deprive the Russian banks from having access to the international SWIFT system. What is the alternative for that, and what are the implications of this sanction? Peace be upon you. Thank you for having us. Thank you, and thanks to all your viewers. The inability to trade would definitely affect both countries, the importers and exporters. So this is going to have a negative effect on Russia as it will be unable to deal with other countries in terms of payment and in terms of receiving their dues from other countries. Will Russia be able to find alternatives? Yes. So it's an issue of efficiency and effectiveness. So for efficiency and effectiveness, if you can help me with that term in Arabic, it would be helpful. So Russia will not be able to pursue the same tactic. This will negatively impact the countries that Russia owes stuff to. Before the 70s, there were alternatives such as the telex. All the banks used to deal with the telex system. It is not a fast, nor is it an accurate and um, uh, recognized means of cooperation or communication, rather. Many can hack into it. Through digital information. There are other alternatives such as cryptocurrency, so they can deal with one another through crypto dealings and other types or modalities of payment. So the impact, the implication is going to be very negative on Russia, but also the countries dealing with Russia are going to be affected by those sanctions in a negative manner. The alternatives, as you know, Iran, for example, in 1912, was deprived of the same SWIFT service, but Iran, on the long run, was able to interact or could find a way to deal with the situation. It was greatly impacted, its economy suffered, just like it's happening in Russia right now. But on the long run, we hope first and foremost that the war ends, that the people are no longer killed like it is happening in Ukraine. But the effect is going to be very negative on Russia more than other countries. Dr. Mahmoud, you were saying that the alternatives that are available right now before Russia and that may be created by Russia are not as effective as the SWIFT system. So this Inaccessibility of Russia to the SWIFT system, how does it affect the economy? It will no longer be able to trade as swiftly and as confidently as it used to. And of course, this is going to cost Russia much more, and the cost is going to increase the cost of commercial trading. The same goes for financial trading because the SWIFT system, is a means of sending messages about sending and receiving money, and it goes through the SWIFT system to a number of or through a number of transactions, and all they have to do is convey the information from one point to another, and they would reach in the same time at the same time, sorry. So let's say I want to send money to my sister, to anyone. I can go to MoneyGram, I can go anywhere, and they will tell you 2 minutes from now, if you pay the money, you will the beneficiary or recipient will be able to collect them. So at the same time, immediately, in almost in real time. Now, for the telex and other such transactions, they are not as fast. They're much more costly as well. So for Russian banks, this is going to be more costly, slower. So the time value of money suffers here. Money goes from one point to another very quickly. So it flows and many can use it. But due to the slow movement of Russian money, this is going to be much more costly. So Dr. Mahmoud thinks that the lack of commercial trading is going to affect the resources, but also or the importer, but also the exporter. Mr. Nasser Tamimi, researcher living in the UK. The West decided to reduce its needs of Russian energy exports and then to give it up fully. How long would it take it to achieve that? Thank you so much for having me. First, I would like to salute you and your viewers. Totally giving up on the Russian energy exports is out of the question. Maybe reducing it is going to be very, very costly. We have three issues: oil, gas, and coal. The main issue for Europe is gas, followed by oil, then coal. And the EU said that it cannot give up on oil. It will need around 1 decade to fully give up the Russian oil. I'm talking about gas rather, and not oil, the speaker said. Now, as for the Russian oil, I don't think it's easy to replace it on the short term. I'm talking from 1 to 3 years from now. There are a lot of complicated issues related to the refineries in Europe, the direction taken by the gas pipes from Russia to the EU, to the type of crude oil available on the market, as well as the alternatives. So those alternatives are only present with OPEC. There are no indicators that OPEC is heading towards making up for the shortage on the market. Now, as for coal, European imports are very high and reach around half, but the European Union said that it may give up coal for this year, and there are alternatives in South Africa, Indonesia, and others, knowing that the market is more flexible now, and that on the short term they can uh, replace the Russian coal. Unless Europe imposes a total ban if the situation escalates in Ukraine. So, in regular circumstances, oil imports usually are replaced fully within not less than 3 years. So, Norway, Algeria could be another alternative. So, also the Qatar capacity needs a number of years to be ready to cover up for the or to make up for this shortage. Generally speaking, you see, Mr. Nasser, that the lack of alternatives before the Western countries makes the threat to reduce the Russian energy imports as unrealistic, at least for now. If Europe right now decides to go to liquefied gas, LNG, we're talking about a sharp rise in prices and a strong competition with the consumers in Asia, Japan, South Korea, and China. The alternatives are in the Middle East and countries that have surpluses. First, in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as long as Saudi Arabia Uh, uh, they have so far said that they are abiding by the OPEC agreement, but so until now, no alternatives for Europe. Dr. Khalifa, many differ on the sanctions and their impact. Many think that they are not really effective in changing the behavior of countries. Some think that they are not effective and they give Cuba as an example, while Iran is given as an example of effective sanctions. What about the sanctions on Russia? Do you think that Russia can bear them and may find ways of circumventing them? This was a question raised by many. We found that the blockade had a very bad effect on the median individual consumption. So Iran was trying to sign the nuclear agreement or very close to the signing of an agreement between Iran and the US. Now, as for Cuba, I think that the blockade affected its behavior and it is now interacting with the United States. Now, as for Russia, there are some figures and numbers that I can rely on to see how it's affecting the Russian economy and if it's going to continue. If we look at the GDP in Russia in 2021, we find that it's around $1.7 trillion dollars, and this is equivalent to 8 times the GDP of Iran. We see that per capita income is $11,000 in Russia right now. Can Russia truly bear those economic sanctions? or not. The Russian economy, through the figures that are internationally published and that I've mentioned, is reliant on great diversification. And at the same time, there are some countries that support it and that have announced that they are not going to give up on the Russian economy, especially Russia, China, and some other countries. Undoubtedly, the welfare of the citizens inside of Russia are going to be negatively impacted, and this is a reality, this is a fact. Because due to the sanctions, the GDP is going to definitely drop. So this is related to the effect of those sanctions on Russia. Now, as for the welfare of the regular citizen in Russia, it's going to drop. When you send your child to study abroad and you want to transfer money from Russia to the US, the transfer may be difficult for now or for a certain period of time. So, on this issue, we can say that the Russian economy is negatively impacted, but the question remains, will the Russian behavior and the Russian regime behavior change and how they deal with Europe and the US in the future? So this is dependent on whether the Russian system change or regime changes in the next 10 years or not, because at the end of the day, this country is dependent on the decisions taken by its governing elite. And this also is dependent on how resilient the Russian citizens are when it comes to dealing with the sanctions. But that welfare is going to drop. Dr. Ahmad, here I understand that the direct effect of those sanctions will only be on the GDP, the welfare of the individual will greatly drop, and according to the or as per the pressure that this will cause on Russia, here we can see if the Russian behavior will change or not. Indeed, the per capita income is the GDP divided by the number of citizens. So under the blockade and the sanctions imposed that are unprecedented, the GDP in Russia is going to definitely drop. That's first. Second, the per capita income is going to definitely drop in the next few years, and therefore an individual's welfare, citizens' welfare is going to drop. In this case, this could be a tool of pressure against the Russian government, and this is what happened in Iran. If you've noticed, in the last 10 years, there are a lot of demonstrations and social unrest in Iran due to the increase in prices, due to the sanctions on Iran. And such is the policy of the United States and the great powers in an attempt to influence the public opinion and then the decision makers, be it inside of Iran, inside of Cuba, or inside of Russia, in the next phase. So welfare will definitely drop because the prices right now in Russia have started to rise. The Russian ruble has dropped greatly against the US dollar and the rest of the world global currencies, and will continue to drop if they don't find a solution to the crisis in the next few months. So the world economy in general cannot take more than 1 or 2 or even 3 month max in this crisis. More than that, we might see a big recession which may continue for years. With this answer, I ask Mr. or Dr. Haddad. The Western countries decided to freeze the Russian deposits therein. How would this affect Russia? Does it affect other depositors in the Russian banks? And can Russia retrieve its money, its funds? And can the Western countries use those deposits to rebuild Ukraine? When you have a saving account that states you cannot use it, this is the first thing that would affect the liquidity and your payment ability or payability. I know that Russia is indebted. They were supposed to be paid in dollars through the deposits in the US. We know that in the United States, the saving account is the is best placed in the United States, especially for many countries such as China. Also, Russia has a lot of money in or many deposits in US banks. So, of course, this is going to greatly affect Russia. The latest information shows that Russia was able to pay its dues for now. The last payment was due in March and it paid it. But does it have the means to pay in the future? Not only because this money is frozen, but also because it is unable to use the dollar due to the it is inaccessibility to the SWIFT. Now, for the Russian banks, their liquidity will be affected. Their financial benefit is going to increase. Sorry, the financial interest is going to rise due to a lack of liquidity. This is going to greatly affect the inflation in Russia. And as mentioned by the doctor, prices will increase. We know that the interest affects many domains, be it the consumption field, anyone contracting loans, they're going to get higher interest rates. This is going to affect commodity prices. Can Russia in the future resist this problem? As mentioned by the doctor, everyone is going to pay the price, especially Russia. We know that Ukraine is paying the price as we see on the TV, on TV. But of course, human suffering cannot be gauged with money. But war has always had its negative implications on both sides. But we come back to our main issue, which is money, liquidity, and payments. There will be an issue with paying debts in the future if Russia does not end the war. This specific point, doctor, do you think that Russia can do something in order to retrieve its money? Is it possible for the Western countries to use this money to rebuild Ukraine? Quickly, please. This is a real problem. I think that Russia, as a big power, I don't think that the Western countries really wanted to um, reach to the point of no return. So, if there were any reconciliation in the future, they may give them back their money, just like the money that was paid for other countries. So, they may force Russia to rebuild Ukraine. I think that in the discussions, they're going to push Russia to help rebuild Ukraine again, and this is going to be very costly for Russia in the future. Do you think that there are producers that can make up for the Russian energy supply in the West? And do you think that they would accept the Western offers? Here we have to identify the source of energy, oil, gas, and coal. As I had mentioned before, there are alternatives to coal, and Europe can give up on coal for 1 or 2 years. Now, for gas, I don't think there's any alternative to Russian gas. There's no country in the world that can make up on its own for the Russian gas. So that's why Europe is now having talks with Azerbaijan, with Algeria, with Qatar, and the US in an attempt to make up for part of this gas. On the short term, I don't think that there's any country that can make up for the Russian gas. This is something that Europe recognized. It said that it can make up for for 2/3 of the Russian gas in a year. I doubt that because there are a lot of elements, a lot of factors, the links between Qatar and the US with other consumers, the capacity of Qatar. So this is going to take time, and in the field of gas, it's very difficult to find an alternative to Russian gas. Now, in terms of oil, European oil refineries are already have already adapted to the Russian oil, and the closest to Russian oil is the Middle Eastern oil. And the extra capacity on a global level is present in the Middle East, specifically in Russia and the UAE. So those are the alternative. Until now, those countries are saying they abide by the OPEC agreement. Other than these political statements, there are doubts that there are countries inside the OPEC, Iraq, and even Iran, can reach the production capacity that they announce every now and then. The main key player or stakeholder in the oil field in the region is Saudi Arabia. And the political statements made by Saudi Arabia on the issue may define the track regarding the situation in the oil market. Now, as for gas, I don't think that there's a strong alternative there to, or any alternative to Russian gas anyway. Now, as for coal, I think that Europe can give that up in the next 2 years. Mr. Nasser, I'd like to ask you the impossible thing you see in the replacement of Russian oil. There are alternatives to Russian oil and gas. What could those be? The increase in the production of other countries. Today, Algeria, if investments are pumped into Algeria, the increase in the American production in the next 3, 4, maybe 5 years, those countries can produce big quantities other than the fact of the change in the oil map. When Russia decided to stop exporting gas to Europe, this gas may be going to China, India, other countries. I don't see any alternative to the Russian gas. Dr. Khalifa, Russia and Ukraine are considered to be the most or the main global exporters of wheat. What are the Arab countries that are mostly affected, and are there any alternatives to Ukrainian and Russian wheat? Thank you so much for this question. Actually, the UN FAO has recognized a sharp rise in the price of wheat and grains in the last month. If we look at the global economy and commodity prices, we see that by the end of Feb and March, we've seen a sharp rise in wheat price. Now, in the futures on the global market, we see that the wheat price is more 60% than it used to be in Jan. What does that mean? The increase in food prices and everyone who deals and imports wheat or maybe other food from Ukraine and Russia. If we are to look at the exporters and exporting and importing countries, or wheat and grain importing and exporting countries, we see that Egypt heads the countries that import from Russia and Ukraine. Same for Turkey. More than 80% of Ukrainian exports to Turkey are wheat. Also, Tunisia, the UAE are further wheat importers from Russia and Ukraine, as per the current statistics. Also, Bangladesh and a number of other countries. That's for the importing countries. So I think that the Northern African countries, and unfortunately, are going to suffer a certain level of damage and bad implications due to this sharp rise of food price commodities, specifically wheat. What are the alternatives before us for Tunisia, Egypt, and countries importing from Russia and Ukraine? There are other wheat producing countries such as Pakistan, China, India, France, Germany. Many countries of the world are wheat producers. The problem is the futures, the contracts that had been signed some time ago to start with new contracts, which may affect the prices of those dealing with them. So the food price increase and the wheat price increase is something that the citizens will start to unfortunately feel the next few months. So we have to be as cooperative as possible, the citizens with their governments, to overcome this problem, because it's such it's an international problem at the end of the day, and the governments can't do much about it, and we all had to suffer because of them. So it's a problem that strikes all of us, and we have to find a way around it, just like we stepped out of many other crises before. That's for the wheat producers and importers. But doctor, what I thought I understood is that there are alternatives for the Arab countries for wheat, but their cost is going to be higher. So it's the citizens who will have to um, deal with this issue mostly. The Gulf countries, for example, their credit and financial capabilities are excellent. So they may be able to deal with this food price increase. As for the developing countries, other developing countries that are importing oil and food, unfortunately, they're going to suffer, whether economically or in terms of the citizens' welfare. As you mentioned, in the African countries and also in some Levant countries, if the situation continues, how impactful could this be? There's another issue related to inflation or food price increase, and this was felt recently by 10% as an average. So the increase in Egypt, for example, was about 10%. So inside this basket, we're trying to take a basket of commodities to calculate it and to calculate the consumer price index, the CPI. So food is one of those commodities. What is the solution before the citizen? They can do nothing about it. The CPI increased in many countries last month to 49%. So the issue with Northern Africa is the hardest, I think. But there are countries that have also greatly suffered and the price from the price increase again. A call to the Egyptian people. The prices will increase, but we have to stand in solidarity to overcome this issue. So this war is something that is out of our control. We have no effect, no impact on it, nothing we can do about it. So we have to be accepting of it, unfortunately. Dr. Mahmoud Haddad, Russia decided to sell energy to non-friendly countries with ruble. Why and what gains does it make? And how will the countries get the ruble, and how will that affect them? That's a very important question because it's been happening for some time, not only for Russia, but for the yuan, the Chinese yuan. I think that there are many people right now who are trying to say that this is one of the reasons why Russia asked to deal with the ruble to find an alternative to the dollar. This will depend on whether these countries will accept or not. Why did they do that? Because with the SWIFT, they were giving it with dollars, and their money was frozen. And maybe they are betting on the fact that the ruble can become a global currency. So we noticed that the ruble has dropped in an unprecedented manner because of this war. This is one of the reasons why Russia continued to ask for ruble, because it wanted demand on the ruble to grow. And the ruble may increase in its value when it's compared to the euro, the dollar, or others. So they did all that to find an alternative to the dollar for it for the dollar not to be the main international trading currency and to strengthen their own currency and to tell the countries that sanctioned them that, oh, here we are finding alternatives to the dollar. This is why Russia wanted the dealings to happen with the ruble, but the Western countries refused that. Russia definitely knew that the countries will not accept that, so why did they do that? As I mentioned to you, they are trying to say that we will find an alternative to the dollar. They deal a lot with China. Also, Saudi Arabia was trying to deal with the yuan, so they were trying. The Russia was trying to copy China. Will they succeed or not? I don't think so because the ruble is not a very well popular currency. They tried to use it as an alternative in order to circumvent the sanctions and to strengthen the ruble. Back to Mr. Tamimi, the Western countries are trying to reduce the energy prices by injecting their own surplus or reserves. To which extent can they continue to do that? At which um, rate will they stop? This is one of the options available for the decision makers in the West, and they pumped 60 million a few weeks ago. However, they didn't affect the prices that went up, unfortunately. Theoretically, the OECD has a large quantity of surplus that would cover the Russian gap or the gap caused by the Russian energy imports ban for at least a year. The issue for Europe, as I said, on the short term is that pumping more may not necessarily affect the prices, and the countries also, the Arab countries, have to make up for those barrels, and which will increase the demand. And with the 90-day surplus, more economic pressure will be put on oil. So when the market sees that the surplus is dropping, this may backfire, especially if the OPEC producing, OPEC oil producing countries will remain on their position and continue to abide by the quota that they had agreed upon previously. A question to all the guests: what is the future of the crisis politically and economically, and how do you see the solution? Starting with you, Dr. Khalifa. Unfortunately for us as economists, we have been trying for quite some time to observe the economic development in the world and to try to forecast any potential recession. or depression. Due to the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, we've seen a global increase in commodity prices, sorry, with an inflation reaching 7.9%. This is such a historical and record increase in the inflation. 5% is what was registered in Europe. For Egypt and African countries, more than 10%. So such is the first issue, which is the increase in the general prices due to the increase in the commodity prices and the increase in the energy prices. The second potential problem that may start in Russia and then move to Europe, to the US, and the rest of the world is stagnation. And it's called the Grand Depression. It will start in Russia and Ukraine with a big problem, which is the increased unemployment, which is the very bad beginning of this depression. Also, the performance of factories in Europe is going to go down. Then we will have the issue of unemployment, another problem that's going to move to Europe. So the crisis will have a spillover effect. That's for the real economy and for the financial markets. So this depression is going to move from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, then the US. And unfortunately, the developing countries in Northern Africa mainly will be affected. So what is the effect, doctor? And how do you see the solution? As mentioned by the doctor, the two main problems will be the financial inflation and how they will affect the poor countries. We've seen gas prices increase in Europe and the US, sorry, and the US government gave $400 extra to every household due to the increase in oil prices. But the poor countries will suffer from famine, not only due to the increase in the price of wheat, but also in the increase of the price of corn, of oil. So this is one reason. Now, the other issue is the drop in production, stagflation as they call it, which means no production, increase in price, and the global production will drop. This is also going to affect payments. The last payments, we've seen that 60% were delayed. So if the war continues for a longer time, it will have a longer term effect, or its impact will last for a longer term. Russia is trying to find and push intensely for an alternative to the dollar. It's trying to deal with China to find an alternative to the dollar. Will they succeed? I think this is something that they've been trying to do for quite some time. So we're trying to look at this from a humanitarian perspective. So, doctor, just one point. You've spoken about famine in the poor countries. Is this related to the war or not? Or the term of the war? Yes, of course. With the war, you destroy infrastructure, you destroy property, and people are unable to consume as we do. So, the longer the war, the heavier the effect on the poor countries, and it would affect the famine in poor countries. So, I always try to look at it from a humanitarian perspective. Mr. Nasser At-Tamimi, what is the future of the current crisis and how do you see the solution? For the forecasts and expectations, it's very difficult right now. Unfortunately, this is some very pessimistic expectations. I don't think that the war will end this year. In terms of the energy, the world has to deal with high prices. The market is going to suffer from big volatility, but we'll see the upward trend of prices, which will outdo everything else. In terms of geopolitical changes, the changes will be very profound. I think there will be a big blow to globalization. China doesn't want to rely on the West. The West doesn't want to rely on Russia or China. So this situation is going to deal a blow to the supply chains. We will see that the world is heading towards regional regions, if we may say so. The U.S. wants to move production to places that are closer to home. The same for China. So many are the implications for this. We will see an increase in the military spending in the Middle East, in Europe, and China, and in many countries. In reality, and the economic realm, what the West did for Russia, and with the confiscation of the Russian central bank deposits or funds, this caused a real transformation in the crisis. This is going to affect other countries, including the Middle East, China. Of course, the effect on the dollar will not be very quick, but many countries will turn their financial assets or transform or take them away actually from the dollar. In my opinion, the dollar with time, it may take a decade or more. It will no longer be the number one currency, or its hegemony on the financial market will go down. You will now follow some of the comments on the social media. A day will come when the UK and the US will turn them down. They may not be able to make up for the shortage for the European countries, maybe only 50%. Where will they get the rest? From Lenin to Putin, the USSR policy has always been the scorched earth policy and genocide. Nobody knows how will this war end on Ukraine. Arif is saying they want a country that is an agent of Russia and Russian sovereignty on Ukraine. This is an invasion with Russian conditions. If Russian forces are incurring losses, this doesn't mean that they are not destroying Ukraine and killing people. Doctor, what is your comment? Thank you for this excellent coverage. This is not strange to the best media outlet in the Arab world. Usually, the US economy emerges stronger after every war. It will have the final say. It's trying to help Europe, and this is what happened after World War II immediately. It's the economy that emerged stronger after the Second World War and set the dollar as the main currency after the Second World War. It emerged with the biggest gold reserves after this war, the World War II. So the US can step out of this crisis as the master of the world, and economically, it's the biggest in the world. The US, with its military prowess, is going to affect the world more than others. The world will come out unipolar, controlled by the US. But for us as developing countries in the Arab world, what should we do? There are 2 points. What I care about is the Arab countries and the countries that we live in, especially North Africa and Egypt. I'm trying as much as we can to find solutions by the government and by the community. The citizens play an as important role as that of the government. So with the the commodity price increase, sorry, I appeal to the Russian and Northern African community to use and optimize and rationalize the use of those commodities. Your role is not less important than the government role. The government is working day and night in Egypt or in the Gulf countries to provide food for the community. I also have a comment on Dr. Mahmoud's comment from the US on a possible famine. No, this is not going to happen. No, Dr. Mahmoud. No famine will happen because of the wars. They usually happen due to drought, due to some natural circumstances or disasters. But most Arab countries have a big wheat or other food commodity reserves. Our role as citizens is not less important than the governments. We have to rationalize our use and consumption. Instead of going each in their car, we carpool. This is the way it's done in the US and in Europe. So we try to rationalize our consumption. This is what I wanted to say about the role of the US, how it would emerge, and what can we do. And I try to appeal to the Arab citizens through this a very important media outlet in in the Arab world. Dr. Mahmoud, thank you. Dr. Ahmad, yesterday I was in a meeting with the head of the International Monetary Fund in one lecture, and she was the one to say the longer the war will last, the more grievance will be suffered by third world countries. Most likely, she mentioned Africa, which means the longer the war lasts, it will be most impactful on the countries, specifically the countries that are unable to pay for oil and gas. So wheat increased, like you mentioned, more than 60%. Corn increased more than 60%. This is going to cause some famine. Most, and not in most countries, in some countries. And the rich countries, there are some countries, there are some countries, as we know, that are still suffering from some famine. So we are trying to reduce this. I ask God Almighty to avoid and to spare people any famine. So war should not last. People suffer. This is not what we want. But we ask God Almighty to stop the war as much as possible, to reduce people's suffering, be it on the lower but also on the higher level. Mr. Nasser At-Tamimi, what do you have to say about our viewers' comments? I agree with some comments that the alternatives for the Russian energy sources are few and the scale of the destruction is too big. But I would like to add something, the current crisis and how it affects the Arab countries. From my perspective, this is going to increase the gap between importers and producers. So Arab or Gulf countries such as Iraq and Algeria are going to benefit greatly from the increase in those prices and will direct a part of those resources. And I hope that this continues. In Egypt and Tunisia, the economic resources are going to be scarce and they might have to head towards subsidies. Unfortunately, this is what I see. I see that the resources are going to be away from economic reform for these countries, and this may lead, with some time, to an increased inflation and indebtedness. Thank you. So we have reached the end of this session 4 of the conference war and between Ukraine and Russia held by the Center for Studies in cooperation with Al Jazeera Mubashir for 2 days. We thank our guest, Dr. Khalifa from Qatar University, from Tennessee and the US, Dr. Mahmoud Haddad, a professor of finance. Thank you so much from London, Dr. Nasser At-Tamimi, writer and resident researcher in the UK. Thank you so much. Thank you to all my viewers, to all my guests, and we meet the viewers in the 5th session entitled Structural Implications, Recalibrating the Balance of Power. Thank you.